Okay, we are rolling. Dr. Olle Johansson, welcome to the Terrain Theory podcast.
Thank you.
Dr. Johansson, can you share a little bit of your background with the audience?
Okay. I am a retired professor in basic and applied neuroscience. I know a little bit about the brain and the spinal cord and the nerves in our body and how they govern us in our daily life and how they control and collect information from all other types of organs, tissues, cells, and so on. But 1977, so you were not even born then, I got interested in a completely other topic, namely health effects and biological effects of artificial electromagnetic fields, which is a long name for power lines, computer screens, Wi-Fi routers, cell phones, DECT phones, baby alarms, wireless smart meters, and so on. And that was more intensified in the beginning of the 80s when I happened to listen to actually a radio program, and it was a very strange coincidence. And I told the story many times to people. One evening at 8 o'clock in my laboratory, I was on my own. I was about to go home, and someone had left the radio on, and I approached it to turn it off. And then I heard a woman, and her name is Kajsa Vedin, and she works in the trade union offices on the west coast of Sweden. And she was talking about some new type of people that got skin problems in front of the newly introduced personal computer screens. And those are the ones we today would call the functional impairment, electrohypersensitivity. But at that time, it was called electrical allergy or computer or screen dermatitis. And, it was a matter of a second or less than that. Had I turned it off, we would not talk today. But I heard this woman and I thought, wow, this is super interesting. And I listened on the program, and she was asking for expertise in clinical neurology. And I'm not a clinical neurologist, but I thought, well, neuroscientist, close enough. I know a little bit about the brain and so on. So I called her, and that's the reason why we have this communication today, actually, because she put me on a completely other train, heading towards questions about health and biological effects of the electromagnetic fields.
So where did you start? Where did your exploration start in terms of like a scientific approach to this topic?
Well, at that time, I worked at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, Sweden, and that I have done my whole life. And for a time, I also worked at the Royal Institute of Technology, but that was a bit later. And what we did initially was that we summoned experts in a whole variety of fields to interview four persons with this new, strange electrical allergy. And we brought them to a place in Göteborg on the west coast of Sweden. And there were experts, in psychology, psychiatry, neuroscience, physics, chemistry, allergology, immunology, dentistry, etc., etc., etc. And we talked with these people and we learned a lot. And based upon that meeting, and we were around 2025 scientists and medical and dental doctors, it was decided that we should start to take skin biopsies because these persons complained that they got redness, heat sensation, pricking pain, skin rashes when they sat in front of the newly introduced computer screens. So we took skin biopsies and it was all blind coded. So myself and my co-workers, we didn't know what each vial contained. And we compared normal healthy volunteers with some typical skin illnesses that had been used as an explanatory model, you can say, and then people and material from people with this electrical allergy. And to make a long story short, it turned out that the electrical allergy or electrohypersensitive people, they completely differed from the skin illnesses as well as from normal healthy volunteers. And that was, of course, a sensational finding. And it really brought a lot of fire to the whole discussion. But at the same time, we also realized we had to do controlled experiments where we would subject people to the exposure from, for instance, ordinary household computer screens, ordinary household television sets and that. But that came later on. Maybe it took, well, 5 to 10 years, because it was difficult at that time, as it is now, to get enough funding to do all these different investigations and experiments.
Can you tell us a little bit about what is happening in the body with these hypersensitive individuals after exposure to these fields?
Yeah, of course. And the interesting part is, and I'm not the only person who have seen that, there are other scientists and medical doctors who have seen that probably everyone reacts in the same way. But normal healthy volunteers, they are not aware of the cellular and molecular changes in their skin, for instance. They don't sense any pricking pain or itching or redness or heat sensation, whereas the electrohypersensitive people, they will react as the clinical yellow canary bird in the coal mine, telling you that something is not good with the exposure situation. And we actually, in the year 2001, and the studies were done 1995, we looked at normal healthy students, medical and dental students, and we put them with their back towards television and computer sets from ordinary households and exposed them for 8 hours. And then we looked in their skin before exposure started, during the exposure, and 24 hours after the 8-hour session. And it turned out that they had the same type of changes that you would see in the skin from electrohypersensitive people, especially regarding a special cell type called the mast cells. And they have nothing to do with telecom masts. They have got their name from German pathologists at the end of the 1900th century. And they call them mastig or mastcellen because they are looking thick and big. And they release the classical chemical compounds like heparin and histamine, and they are the key cell for allergy, asthma, and other oversensitivities. And when you look in the skin of electrohypersensitive people, they have a dramatically increased number of such cells, and they seem to also release their chemical content. And with the normal healthy volunteers, when you looked in their skin after an hour already, you had an increase, and it became even more so after 2 hours, pointing to that these cells reacted not to the classical like nickel or rubber or whatever allergen, but they reacted to the electromagnetic exposures. Therefore, this first term, which was abandoned, electrical allergy, maybe wasn't so bad. Maybe you have an allergic reaction in your body towards an external exposure, just as you would have if you're sensitive to peanuts, nickel, rubber, or something else. So that, again, was a very, very sensational finding. And also it would, on a single cell, the mast cell, and a single molecule, histamine, actually explain all the subjective symptoms that people with electrohypersensitivity reports. And this is still a very, how should we say, important and wide trail that scientists are following, and this mast cell histamine model. And we also wrote a number of papers from a more theoretical point of view, pointing to that this could be the common denominator for the problems that you see. And of course, the interesting part is that in our study with the normal healthy volunteers, the students, after 24 hours, they went back to their should we say, normal life, which compared to students 100 years ago is very, very abnormal and unnatural. So the question is, of course, what kind of long-term effects would you see if you are exposed, as you and I are, wherever we live or work, or where we walk and go to restaurants, coffee shops, and we are constantly exposed to a myriads of different electromagnetic signals. And the long-term effects, we don't know yet. And the question is, what will happen not only during our life, but from other studies? And I'm thinking particularly about Magras and Xenos from Greece, who studied the effect on mice, and they could see in the fifth generation that they became practically infertile. And that would mean for you and me, if we have children, maybe they will be all right, the grandchildren, but the grandchildren will suddenly not be able to get new children. And then it's a bit too late to call back around 150 years and say, hey, could you please stop what you're doing 2024, or actually before 1994, because this is an older study. So that's something I'm often thinking about, especially when I see young people, teenagers and children. What kind of a future will they have? And not only they, but their grandchildren. So that's an interesting part.
So you mentioned some of the symptoms of this exposure, screen dermatitis, so release of histamine that would cause redness, itchiness, the same sort of allergic reaction response one might get, and the listener's probably familiar with. And then you've also just mentioned potential fertility issues. What are some of the other symptoms that you've discovered in folks who are electrohypersensitive?
What they often refer to, and you know, the initial problems often is from the skin, and it's often in front of some kind of computer screen. And nowadays, of course, the most common computer screens are called cell phones. They're just a very small version of a laptop or computer screen, and they report exactly these kind of symptoms, but it is followed often about problems with, for instance, short and intermediate memory, concentration problems. They can have heart palpitation, breathing problems, and so on. And for each one of these, you will find in the scientific literature corresponding animal data, showing, for instance, and this is fantastic work by Henry Lai and his co-workers at the University of Washington in Seattle. They show that the rats in a maze, they were trying to find food, and when they were exposed for 45 minutes, not 45 years, 45 minutes, with the Bluetooth frequency 2.45 gigahertz, then they had a dramatically impaired short-term memory, as well as a loss of concentration capacity. They started to do and perform badly and do mistakes, which they normally wouldn't do. They are very, very good, these rats, to find food. So again, you know, when I talk to people in Stockholm here and Sweden and elsewhere, of course, I listen and hear that ordinary people often refer to that they have problems with memory capacity, memory retrieval, and there are problems with different types of concentration issues. They lose concentration, which could be dramatically dangerous if you have, for instance, an airline pilot or a lorry driver, a taxi driver or something. Well, we need to keep an open eye for this. And I'm concerned from the point of view that I hope that the authorities, not only in Sweden, of course, but worldwide, that they do keep an eye on this. And especially if we leave the human beings and go to the other 8.7 million species, which are not all of them, but most of them right now exposed in the same way. And they are really innocent bystanders. They haven't invented, bought, used these kind of technologies, but they are exposed. And there are a lot of question marks around, for instance, so-called pollinators, the most famous being the honeybee and the dramatic loss worldwide of these insects. And there are, again, published laboratory experiments where people have shown that these insects, they do not like to be exposed to electromagnetic fields of different types. So again, you see, you have like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. There are distances in between, but they are moving towards the center. And maybe you will see in the future that we need to change the technology or maybe even abandon it altogether, but we don't know yet.
Right. That was actually what I was going to ask is, I mean, you've been studying this since the 70s, which is remarkable. And I can only imagine that you've been slightly disheartened as time has moved on because it only seems to be getting worse. We seem to be compounding the problem and adding more of this type of non-native technology. But that's what we hear about, non-native frequencies. Is there a technology that is closer to a native frequency within this field of communication and electricity, or do we simply need to abandon it altogether?
Hopefully, we don't need to abandon anything because future scientists will show that all the other scientists were wrong. But that would mean that tens of thousands of publications in top science journals all must be wrong at the same time. So the probability for that kind of development is rather small. And therefore, your question is extremely important. You can ask around what kind of natural fields do we have? And we do have extremely low frequency fields, like in the 50 or 60 hertz range, which you use for power line distribution of electricity. We have static fields from the Earth. And then from the outer space, we have, of course, microwaves and similar frequency ranges, the same microwaves that we use for our cell phones and Wi-Fi routers and so on. The thing is, though, that the allowed exposure levels compared to natural background is in the order of a quintillion times, which is a 1 with 18 zeros after, or much more. So the increase in exposure is, and I don't know the proper English word, is it astronomical or colossal or biblical or whatever? It's just enormously. But since it's invisible, people don't think about it. Would it be visible, then you wouldn't see anything because they would block out even the sunlight, you know. It would be so very dense irradiation, so you would be completely blinded by it. But since it's invisible, you don't think about it. But of course, as a scientist, and you know, when I give lectures, I often start by asking the audience, and I say, imagine for a moment that we turn off everything, all electricity, all radio, all television, all everything except the third generation mobile telephony. We just keep that. And then I ask the audience, how much more such electromagnetic field radiation is your body hit with today compared for like 30, 40 years ago? Is it twice as much, 3 times as much? And, you know, the audience goes, And one time there was an old man who said, no, it's much more. It's 100 times more. And the whole audience turned to him and said, no, you are crazy. No authority in the world would allow an increase by 100 times. You have to realize that, you know. But the answer is it's a quintillion times higher or more. So I mean, and you know, even for a scientist, it's hard to understand these numbers. I often ask people, you know, imagine tomorrow that the outdoor temperature has increased a quintillion times. Not only Sweden, the US, and planet Earth will just disappear in a flame, you know. I mean, it's just impossible to imagine that kind of temperatures. You know, the inner of the sun is only 12 million degrees centigrade. It's nothing really compared to this, you know. So, I mean, I do hope, and I pray every evening, you know, I pray that I, as a mental fire brigade soldier, is wrong. And that everything is safe and fine and good, and no one is going to be affected or hurt, and no pollinators, no sperm cells, no bacteria, nothing will be affected. But of course, again, you know, I have to be scientifically sound and tell myself, but, you know, that means that tens of thousands of publications have to be withdrawn from the science literature. And that has never happened before, you know. So, no, I don't believe we are wrong. And I do hope that all authorities and presidents and kings and parliaments and prime ministers and know what they're doing. Unfortunately, from what I have learned through the last decades, I don't think they do.
Do you think it's ignorance, or do you begin to suspect that there's something, a larger agenda at play?
Well, I think the agenda, and that is, of course, large, and it's nothing peculiar with it. It's just the classical money greed, because we're talking about probably the biggest milk cow ever on planet Earth. It is bigger than, for instance, the oil industry. So it's a colossal milk cow, and everyone wants to milk it as long as it's possible. And the number of dollars per millisecond that is earned is just, again, astronomical. So I think it's more about greed than about real human need. And I'm not naive. I do understand that many of these gadgets are fantastic. But of course, your fantastic computer game is as fantastic if you use a wired shielded laptop instead of a wireless gadget. So there could be simple ways of reducing exposure dramatically in society. And for a parent, instead of having a wireless baby monitor, maybe they could have the baby with them in the kitchen or wherever they are, you know. My mother did that in the... So it's not that complicated, but people get used to and accustomed to different helping gadgets, and sometimes big mama and big papa, I mean the government and parliament, has to say no more of this. But I understand we then need maybe even more data, although I hear many of my colleagues point to, no, Olle, we have enough to react and act upon them. And don't forget, there are big players that have reacted and acted upon the knowledge base I'm referring to. And they did that more than 25 years ago. And I'm thinking about, for instance, the manufacturers, the operators who sell all these gadgets to you and saying, oh, they are safe, they're good, you know, no problem. But they don't believe it themselves. So they have written in their different licenses and so on, parts that make them avoid any form of responsibility. There is not a single insurance or reinsurance company in the world that takes any form of responsibility for health effects of electromagnetic fields. And even the World Health Organization in Geneva, Switzerland, has backed off. And also the radiation protection authorities, they will tell you it's safe, but for safety reasons, you better put it away, do very short calls, have a wide system, and blah, 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 all of that, you know. So they have, I mean, I know Americans and Englishmen and so on, they have a very good saying, follow the money. And these different entities definitely have followed the money, and they have completely abandoned ship. And I may remember, and that's 22 years ago, in London, there was a conference, public conference, anyone could come and listen. And you had like Lloyd's UK, which is the largest insurance dealer in the world, had Swiss Re from Switzerland, which is the largest reinsurance dealer. And they all said that for them, there was not a question whether the radiation from a cell phone was dangerous or not. They knew it was dangerous. The question was instead, who is going to pay for the party in the future when people want to have compensations, maybe after a brain tumor surgery or something. And they said, we don't want to be there then. So therefore, we have abandoned ship. And of course, they are private companies. They can do whatever they want to. And they have like a blacklist. And it's a very interesting list because most recently when I saw it, they have added a few other things which you and I are bathing in. And that would be like nanotechnology, which you find everywhere on the planet now, in every sample from soil, air, water, food, clothes, blood, you name it. It's everywhere. But the insurance companies say, no way, we don't take any form of responsibility. And also gene-modified organisms, like you buy corn to eat, no. So there is a lot of safe products in your store, which they believe is not safe. And it's so harmful and dangerous, so they have completely abandoned this ship, you know. So it's more telling than any test tube experiment that I could come up with, really, you know. And I would have done the same. Honestly, if I was the head of one of these insurance companies, I would have done the same, definitely, based upon the knowledge we have.
Then, in your mind and in conversations with colleagues and others in this space who are trying to sound the alarm as you are, do you see any possible recourse to push back or hold any of these entities accountable?
Well, I mean, the industry and the operators, the manufacturers and so on, they have done nothing wrong. They went to parliaments and governments and asked them if it was all right to blanket their countries and their population with this type of electromagnetic field radiation. And the governments and parliaments said, oh yeah, that's exactly what we want. So they gave a green light, go ahead. So if you should charge anyone, it's definitely the governments and parliaments, health authorities, radiation protection authorities, and so on. The companies, I mean, they are interested in producing new gadgets, new solutions, new versions. What I'm asking for often is that we need tomorrow's green, human, and environmental friendly technology. And it's not only in this sector, there are a lot of other sectors. So maybe from just a profit and greed point of view, the industry will, tomorrow, when we wake up, there will be something completely new. I mean, just imagine a few years ago, no one had heard about Tesla and electric cars. And suddenly they wake up to a new world, you know, and that could happen here too. Some other kind of device, gadget, I don't know, system that would prove to be harmless. And we talked about before that maybe by using other forms and frequencies of electromagnetic signals, you can solve this problem. I'm not that intelligent, so I cannot do it, you know. But there are others, of course. So I hope people will come up. And you know, greed and profit can actually be a good driver in the sense that it put a lot of force into a system. And if they see a problem here, I hope they will solve it. And if they don't, then of course there are issues that are quite scary. Let me just name one, and it's from 2017. American scientists led by Tahiri, and they studied ordinary bacteria that you and I have on us and in us right now while we talk. And they exposed them to the old-fashioned GSM or second generation mobile telephony, and also to super modern Wi-Fi routers. And to make a long story short, again, not very much happened, except for one little thing, and I'm laughing because this little thing is big. And the bacteria, and that has been repeated a number of times. Most recently, it was about soil bacteria, but this time it was about our own bacteria, and they became antibiotic resistant. 2022, I think it was, a representative of the World Health Organization in Geneva in Switzerland was interviewed in a television program, and the reporter asked him if the COVID-19 pandemic is the worst threat to mankind ever. And the guy from the WHO, he kind of laughed and said, no, we will manage it, no problem, But then the reporter was smart and said, what is the worst threat? Oh, that's easy to answer, he said. That's antibiotic resistance in healthcare. Did I freeze in my chair to solid ice, because he gave the same information as Tahiri and them had given 5 years before, namely that bacteria become antibiotic resistant. And I remember 2017 when this was published. At the same year, and completely independent of each other, the G20 countries had a special meeting in Europe about the fact that more than 25,000 Europeans died prematurely because of antibiotic resistance in healthcare. It was said that by 2050 worldwide, around 10 million people each year would die prematurely because of this. But if you take Tahiri and you take the G20 countries and then allow them to meet, then the 10 million could easily be 8.2 billion people, because then people start to die from things you died from at the end of the 1900th century, namely a splinter in your thumb. Before antibiotics, we were in jeopardy, you can easily say, and that could happen again. And I called some friends that are medical doctors and asked them about this. And they said, well, someone has to very, very quickly come up with some other type of antibiotic compound, because we are fighting a losing war. And, without these. And then you top it off with no pollinators, effects on the immune system, effects on sperm cells, and so on. Well,
on this podcast, we have a slightly different take on sort of the war mentality and trying to kill off the bad guys. And I think the work you're doing is so important because to acknowledge the insults, not the least of which are the EMF fields, that's where you nip the sickness in the bud, is you remove the toxicities from the get-go instead of trying to deal with the aftermath, like what I call a Band-Aid culture. So hopefully we don't have to get into this war of how much can we kill to stay alive, but we just get it right at the beginning. But just to circle back real quick, because you mentioned Tesla, do you have thoughts on the actual Nikola Tesla and the work that he was doing?
Well, he was, of course, a fantastic person, and as all that kind of fantastic entrepreneurs and inventors, he was a bit of an odd character. And as you know, he's probably, and this is of course guesswork, we cannot go back and ask him, but from the historical records, he seems to have been maybe one of the first electrohypersensitive persons. So he's often mentioned when it comes to this functional impairment. And of course, now, today, the most famous electrohypersensitive person is the former head of the World Health Organization. She is a medical doctor. She is the former Prime Minister of Norway, Gro Harlem Brundtland. And she is a super intelligent woman. And she became, during her work, electrohypersensitive. And she has come forward in a very solemn way and just talked about how it is and what she needs to do to function in her office. And now she's retired, but nevertheless, a very important witness, you can call it. But I agree.
Yeah, somebody high profile, right?
Yeah, And you know, I agree with the nipping of the bud. That's a very good expression, because I've tried to get people to at least listen, and many do, and many thanks to people like you making fantastic podcasts or interviews or television or whatever. But it doesn't seem to really hit home yet. And we haven't touched upon a lot of the other issues here, but there are quite a number of scary things. And now we only talk about the electromagnetic fields. And as you pointed to, there are chemical exposures, there are stress, there is a lot of other things that we need to cope with. And I would hate to see people getting harmed in a way that we could have easily protected them from by just nipping the bud, as you say, you know. And I hope that people will listen and will try to come up with tomorrow's green, human, and environmental friendly technology, because it is needed as it is now.
Yeah, what's frustrating about the EMF is that, you know, like I'll speak for myself and maybe Ben, like we're very proactive about the things that are within our control in terms of sourcing clean water, clean food, clothes that are not synthetic, you know, right on down the line. But it's those things that are out of our control, the energy grid, the frequency fence that's being built around us.
Yeah.
That does seem like it's bigger than what we're able to take on head on as individuals.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I see a lot of very, very good activists and campaigners. But again, they don't seem to reach all the way. And as I said before, I do hope that, for instance, Tahiri and co-workers in the United States, myself, Henry Lai, etc., that we all are wrong. Because if we are not, and we put everything out in the open, and no one really, or I shouldn't say no one, but most people didn't listen, especially not the ones that had the power tools in their hands to change society. And I say again, I don't want to rip the computer game out of your hands. Please use it, have fun with it. But maybe, you know, in a shielded wired format or in some other way. So it doesn't harm you, your sperm cells, your girlfriend's egg cells, your kids, the dog, the cat, the goldfish, you know, and the plants, the bacteria, and all of that, you know.
Doctor, have you done much research into Wilhelm Reich's work in terms of sort of balancing energy fields with orgone technology?
No, I have not. I only read just a bit about it, so I'm definitely not an expert on it.
Neither am I. I just thought I'd ask, but I'm intrigued by the type of work he was doing, and people claim to have had some successful results in terms of pushing back as something that you can do to push back against some of these stuff.
Yeah. And also, not to be forgotten, there are quite a number of different claims, especially on the internet. And I cannot really judge this, you know, but it's of course important that such claims are replicated in a controlled manner using the ordinary consensus model in science, because I see a lot of different claims that are unfounded, I would call, you know, they're wild speculations. But of course, anything around you started with a wild speculation. So there could be grains of very important knowledge hidden there, but we need to pick it out and use it.
Speaking of speculation, there's a lot of speculation and conspiracy theories surrounding 5G as a emergent technology. And I wondered if you could walk us through some of the facts about 5G.
Well, I mean, 5G is a new version of cellular technology, and it's technically more advanced than before. But at least in Sweden and in the countries I have contact with, it's not really introduced yet as it's meant to be. So, for instance, frequency-wise, here in Sweden, we use the same frequencies as for 3 and 4G, so it's not very much difference. But there are technical aspects that makes it interesting. And as you say, there are a number of speculations, and I don't have enough data really to either confirm or not confirm the speculations. We are trying currently to find funding to investigate a few of these, well, I would say hypotheses more than speculations. But without the money, it's very, very difficult to do anything. So if I just raise my head and look here behind me, I see a lot of shelves, and on those shelves I have project plans lying and collecting dust. And I would love to be able to take down these, and start working on them. But we have to wait with it. And of course, the promise with the 5th generation mobile telephony is that everything should be better, bigger, faster, better, bigger, faster. But as I said, for the consumers, it's yet to be seen, because the infrastructure is not really built as it was meant to be built.
What are some of those hypotheses?
The most, how should I say, mostly voiced is that when Wuhan exploded with cases of COVID-19, at the very same time, they were building the 5G infrastructure in this Chinese city. And then people are looking and seeing that similar time-wise associations was seen all over the world. That could be, of course, coincidence. And there are single papers pointing to that maybe the energy used in 5G has been used to drive various populations of viruses and virus-induced illnesses. From my point of view as a scientist, I don't see any foundation for such statements, but I could be wrong, of course. And I could only go to Sweden. We lived through the COVID-19 pandemic. Personally, I didn't change anything, nothing. I traveled around Sweden. I traveled abroad. I traveled like to West Africa and so on. And there was no problems. I never used any face masks, rubber gloves, these sanitation, hand sanitizers, nothing. But at the same time, here in Sweden, we did read about countries like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, United States, and so on. And the word draconian measures was introduced in our minds. It was just enormous demands on the population, which we in Sweden didn't have anything of. And we didn't witness any increase in deaths, and there are no deaths associated with the COVID-19 vaccines either. So either we, for some reason, were different to other countries, or the measures, political measures, were different. And I believe in the latter.
Well, I believe in the former because I have a little bit of Swedish heritage myself. I think it's the robustness and increased constitution of us Swedish folk.
I didn't want to go into that, because sometimes I've joked and said, we are Vikings. That's and people go, oh, yeah? Oh, that could explain everything. No.
Dr. Johansson, what are some steps that you would suggest for the listener who wants to mitigate the negative impacts of some of these exposures to non-native EMF?
That's, of course, rather easy when it comes to your personal gadgets. You can do all the things you're doing either without these gadgets. For instance, you can whip your cream by hand instead of electrically. Some things are difficult, of course, to get rid of. You would need some electricity, for instance, for light bulbs, etc. But you can have a wired laptop, a shielded wired, and the same for your tablet, the same for your telephone, everything. So you can reduce the exposure quite a lot from your own gadgets. But when I sit here, for instance, I know if I take up one of these measurement tools, there will be rather high levels of microwave exposures, because I think it's about a kilometer away. There is a big base station with several antennas for 3, 4, and even 5G. And they are sort of illuminating this room I'm sitting in and myself. And those you cannot shut off easily, of course, you know. So you can do some things, but some are more difficult. What you could do, if you want to shield yourself, is that you can have, for instance, this microwave shielding cloth. There are aluminum foils, there are paints, etc., which you can use, but it will cost money. Naturally, and it depends on what exactly do you want to do. So there's a lot of things you can do. Some are very cheap, some are more expensive, some are very expensive if you want to shield like a whole room, including the ceiling and the floor and all the walls, you know. So that could be more expensive.
How does the listener parse between the technologies that actually do work and those that claim to work but don't do anything? Like, do you have brands that you suggest or recommend?
Oh, very good point. That's very important, that you need either to have an expert that you hire to help you. And some of these shieldings, for instance, could be complicated, and you need to measure. If you put up, and to the right of me here, there is, for instance, a window, and you could have shielding material on the window, and then you have to make sure that you have the claimed reduction in the room. If they say that all the radiation will go away, then exactly that's what you should expect to see on your meter. So it's important to do these measurements. And if you don't have a meter yourself, as I said, you can hire someone to help you. And I don't want to sort of point any fingers in any directions, but if they need advice, they are warmly welcome to contact, for instance, me after the program and put questions, because I could direct them in different directions to different companies. And some are, as you indicate, of course, better than others. And if you see, and I don't know the proper English for that, very dramatic claims, then always ask for scientific studies proving the claim, including independent replications, also proving that the first scientific group was right. And a company should be able to give it to you. And if they can't, then maybe you should withdraw and look for another company.
Understood.
Is there a meter that you would recommend? Is it as simple as ordering something on Amazon that anyone could use?
If my brain was slightly better, I would remember the name of it. And right now I've forgotten. There are a few that are better than others. And better, you know, you can buy a meter for, let's say, in US dollars, it will cost 200. You can have one that will cost 100. And you can have one that will cost 25,000 US dollars.
Right.
They should and will give the same reading, but with the expensive one, you will have more decimals. So the accuracy increases, and there are a few other things that you can use it more scientifically. But I would stop around, let's say, between 100 and 200 US dollars and look for something.
That's good advice. So even an affordable one is plenty, is all that you need to get started.
Yeah, exactly. And you are just looking for a difference. Before you shield, for instance, your wall and window, and after, and if they promise you to shield like 95%, that's exactly what you should then read.
Right.
If you read no difference, then you have been scammed. So
I think also just doing tests on, for example, your router.
Yeah.
Turn your router off and see what the difference is. Turn your cell phone off, see what the difference is.
Exactly. Yeah, and now we have not touched upon electrohypersensitive people, because they will differ from the metering, in the sense that they can be very, very sensitive. So even if you remove like 95 or 99%, they will still react. And it's exactly the same for a peanut allergic person. If you remove 99 of the peanuts in the aircraft, they will still have an anaphylactic shock. So they are very sensitive, and therefore they need to decide using their body as a measurement tool. And I always tell people that when you feel it's all right, then it's probably all right. So start with that, and then the meter doesn't really help you in that sensation. But for normal healthy volunteers and people that are generally concerned for themselves and their children and the dog and cat and so on, start with these kind of shielding techniques and see what you can get from it.
Dr. Johansson, there are widely accepted and used tests to determine if a person is allergic to a peanut. Are there similar tests to determine if someone is allergic to these?
Well, they are right as we speak being developed, actually. And that's one of the things on my personal agenda. I would like to see a very simple test when it comes to these reactions, and also a test that maybe one could use, for instance, in public media, like a demonstration kit. But since this is a functional impairment, and previously it was known as a disability, and before that handicap, no such tests or proof are needed. The United Nations is very, very strict and points to that even if you lack any form of proof for a functional impairment, you can never hold it against the person with the functional impairment. And most impairments you cannot measure.
Okay.
I will give one example. If you look at me now, can you please tell me if I can speak and understand French?
I couldn't tell you.
Is there like a thermometer you can put somewhere in me to tell you?
Not that I'm aware of.
No, that's true. So what do you need to do? And this is it sounds like a joke, but this is not a joke. This is the definition by the United Nations. You have to trust Olle Johansson when he says, no, I cannot understand and speak French.
I can't put a croissant or a baguette in front of you and see if you react.
Maybe you can see that I have already done that test, so. And they are successful. No, this is very important. Most functional impairments are not impairments you can measure or prove. You have to trust people. And that is the definition. And following that, it means that every human being during his or her life, many, many times, especially when they're children and teenagers, will be functionally impaired. And the odd thing is also, or odd, it's natural, it's dependent on the environment. It's the environment that tells you if you're impaired or not. And when I go to Paris, I need someone to meet me and help me and explain what's going on. And that French man or French woman will most likely be equally impaired if they come to Stockholm, because here they don't understand Swedish. So then I would help them here instead, And this is very typical, like electrohypersensitivity. If you put such a person in a very low background radiation environment, they are fine. But if you introduce all these different gadgets, then suddenly they are not fine. So it's the environment that is the patient. It's the environment which should be treated. And for all for all functional impairments, it's accessibility measures that is called for, like a wheelchair ramp for a person with movement disorders, or an electrosanitized car for an electrohypersensitive people, or some personal assistant for Olle Johansson coming to the home of the croissant. So you are right.
Dr. Johansson, we have taken up a lot of your time, so I want to transition and start to wrap this up. So I'm going to ask you a question that we ask all of our guests to bring it back
Yep.
around to your personal health. What are your non-negotiables or the daily habits that you do to tend to your terrain and your health?
I love that question. It's so very fundamentally important. And every day I try to take a walk between 7,000 up to 20,000 steps. I cannot sort of live without it. And if I go somewhere for a conference or something, I try to take this walk anyhow. And also, I must meet people and animals and plants and bacteria and fungi and viruses. Life on the planet is crucial for my well-being. So those are the two, I would say.
Wonderful.
And also, I also love using my brain. I have to admit that. Many people, they go to the gym and exercise everything below this part. No, I love it. I just love it. To sit down and ponder and think and try to solve human questions and problems and help people. I love helping people.
Well, it sounds like you're doing just that. And last question, where can the audience learn more about you and your work?
Well, I have done a short compilation. Well, it's actually not so very short, to be honest. And it's found via my fundraiser call. And I know you will post it after this interview. So you can just click on it and read about me. And again, if someone needs to have much more details about me, my work, and about other people's work, please feel free to contact me, and I will try my very best to answer your inquiries and questions.
Wonderful. And we will put that link in the show notes of the episode. Dr. Olle Johansson, thank you so much for joining us on the Terrain Theory podcast. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. It was a great honor. Thank you.
Oh, why don't you go ahead and get us here?
Happy summer, friends, and welcome to the after party in the Pineal Room with your friends and hosts, Dr. Mike and Dr. Ben.
Dr. Olle Johansson. Did I get that right? Olle.
You really nailed the pronunciation of his name the first time you said it. Really went deep with the Swedish pronunciation.
Yeah, I channeled, you might say.
You did. Yeah, you just let it fly.
I channeled those.
You hit a flow state with that shit.
And then proceeded to butcher it as we got farther.
Became more American as you went, right?
Yeah. Well, this is an American production.
And how? It's right from the North Country of New Hampshire, baby.
The North Country of New Hampshire. You got a nice week-long dose of.
I got a really great dose. I was a little heartbroken rolling home. This was just, folks, that we're post Porcupine Fest here, recording this on the Tuesday following. So I was with Ben all last week from, I guess, Sunday to Sunday, really a solid week. Correct. And it's a really special place where you live. And it was really nice to spend that much time there and sort of latch on to the vibe.
And it was a different experience for both of us, this Pork Fest, as opposed to last year. So this is our second year now in a row. And we also got a real heavy dose of nature, didn't we?
Yeah. Yeah. It was really hot early in the week, and we sought out some cold water, and we found some beautiful, beautiful spots that were like cathedrals in and of themselves.
Yeah. The Lower Ammonoosuc Falls.
Oh my gosh.
What do you think of that?
Even just the little creek by your house was heavenly. It's a testament to like how beautiful the country is up there.
Yeah.
And you can see why some of the locals are like very protective of it. Like any local would be about a beautiful spot, but there's something about there that does feel a little more set apart, a little more off the beaten track, a little less discovered, a little less a product of like Instagram culture. It's just like really wild and quiet and something very pristine, but also because it's New Hampshire, it's like got a toughness to it, all that granite and all. Correct.
Yeah. Coming from Vermont, or at least the part of Vermont that I was in, Chittenden County, which is where Burlington is, and it's a refined wilderness. It's a refined nature. Yeah. The Green Mountains are so accessible, and you see tons of people on these trails. And the White Mountains is raw. Like some of this is just raw, and the White Mountains in the wilderness feel like, yeah, if you get it on the wrong day,
Yeah.
it could kill you. Not that that's, and maybe I'm saying that just to scare everyone away, but yeah. So I'm not there yet. I'm not there yet. But it's interesting because even as you point out that maybe the locals feel a little guarded and protective, you still have people like the North Country Porcupines. This would be the North Country chapter of the Free State Project, who are actively welcoming and helping move into this space folks who are of a similar mindset, mainly just freedom oriented.
Correct. It's very encouraging and accommodating. Absolutely. But it's sort of, there's a vetting process to some degree. They want the right people up there, and I get it.
Yeah. Show me your carry. show me your concealed carry. What folding knives do you have on you? Yeah, kind of thing. That's an oversimplification and misrepresentation as well.
Yeah.
For the sake of humor. And folks, we will do a deeper dive into the PorcFest experience, where you got a bunch of interviews lined up from with folks who we met down there, and just to give you all a better sense. I mean, it's the same week that Music and Sky is going on, which is which is a festival we both really want to get to, because it's like, if there were our people, they're certainly out there at Music and Sky, and it looks like an awesome event. However, PorcFest is happening right here in my backyard. And as we found out this past week, like, this is also our people. I mean, we met some incredible individuals, and everyone's just of the same mindset. Like, we just want more freedom. Like, basically, we just want to be free, sovereign humans. And that as the commonality does incredible things for fostering like immediate friendships.
Yeah, I and that's true of the health freedom space in general. When you meet a new person who shares that ideology, but especially at PorcFest, it really made sense to me this time to be there for a solid week. And I think early on, you and I were like, well, we'll be there for the first half of the week, and then I'm going to have Grayson, and I should probably get home and all that. But we really stuck it out. I mean, you were sort of in and out towards the end, but you still showed up a little bit each day.
Yeah.
But when in life do you get to spend a solid week doing something like that? Unless it's your planned vacation or something. This is a little bit more like that. It's an intentional, to use the phrase, an intentional community for 1 week. And when you have that much time, you can really sink into it, and you can get to know people over a longer time, and not just like share a conversation on an afternoon and then maybe that's all you get. You're going to circle back with those people. You're going to have a meal together. And it really clicked for me why. And we spoke about this, my only reference for festivals is generally music festivals. And there are festivals where people set up in the campsite and they don't have any interest in the programming on the stages. And that, as a musician, I always sort of found that heartbreaking. Like, well, don't you want to see what I do? But no, that's not why they're there. Like, it's a festival within a festival. And that festival within a festival is more about camaraderie and like really basking in company. And that's what PorcFest is.
Yeah, agreed. And we'll get into that. We'll get into that more. But speaking of new friends and new acquaintances, Dr. Olle Johansson.
Yeah, what a wonderful man. I really enjoyed that. And I love how open-minded he is. I feel like I always have Tom Cowan chirping in my ear, right? Anytime someone brings up virology or viruses, that it's like incumbent upon us to sort of push back against that at some degree. And I think he would be receptive to it if we were to follow up with him and send him some papers, not books, some resources.
Yeah, some papers. And again, yes, for the audience member, of course, thank you. You took the words right out of my mouth when you interjected and said, well, on this podcast, we have a slightly different mindset as it pertains to being at war with things, which was very well said. And there's a time and a place, of course, and we've discussed this before with past guests. And I don't think that it needs to invalidate everything that a person says if they haven't been exposed yet to the quote unquote no virus narrative. I think that you've got to take what makes sense. And if he and his colleagues are approaching the subject of EMF or non-native EMF using the scientific method, which it sounds like obviously he's well versed in. And until we, of course, dive into all their papers, we won't know for sure their methodology, but it certainly seems like he has that approach and that scientific mindset. We can take those findings and silo them away from his belief that EMF exposure around certain bacteria create antibiotic resistance, which I wanted to touch on with you in the after party in the Pineal Room. And I'm wondering if the audience member who's also picked up on that is if their wheels are spinning as well. What exactly is going on? So you have bacteria, I don't know exactly which one, being exposed to this field, this radiation, and then developing resistance to antibiotics. What's actually happening? So from the terrain perspective, we look at antibiotics as a bad thing. Antibiotics against life. Antibiotics are things that no one should be using. Maybe in life or death situations can you resort to using it. I think it was like Beth Lambert said, that's the only time she would ever consider using it. I'm willing to bet that there are folks in the terrain camp who would just say, no, never. There's always a better solution. Fair. But what is actually happening with these bacteria who are exposed to radiation and then developing antibacterial properties? Is this an adaptation, just a robustness? Because we would look at that and go, they're resistant. They are now better equipped to live or survive. Is this a survival thing? Is this necessarily bad? Is this a negative that these bacteria would become resistant to antibiotics? Is this potentially a good thing, or is it just a sign of an adaptation that's happening? And I would hope for maybe more research around other effects on the bacteria of exposure to radiation besides just resistance to antibiotics. But I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, well, it's all tied up in the pleomorphic cycle, right?
Quite possibly. Absolutely, quite possibly. I mean, it certainly has my wheels spinning, and I don't think I'm not gonna conclude anything jibber jabbering right now. It's all just to say, like, through this terrain lens, what else is happening? Yeah. Certainly, something's happening to that bacteria because of exposure. What's the good? What's the bad? Doesn't necessarily have to be bad because it has developed a resistance to antibiotics, which is something that we would look at and go, well, that's just napalm to your system. Anyway.
Right. Yeah. No. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah. And of course, he does mention viruses and the existence of viruses. And again, like, just take what we can from his research, and maybe leave the rest. We can send him we'll send him some papers, as you said.
Yeah.
We'll send him a farewell to virology. Yeah.
And as you've said a few times, like, it can be very difficult to connect two dots that are right on top of each other, right? He knows the harms of EMF, etc. He itemized them. He pointed out the 5G rollout in Wuhan, and is it a coincidence or is it not? He's got that in mind. He mentioned that he didn't follow any of the draconian protocols and the hand sanitizer and the masks and etc.
Yeah.
So it's like
he's halfway there.
He's more than halfway there. He's right. All the way there. It's almost a question of semantics at this point.
Could quite possibly be. Yeah, it was an interesting to see Sweden as the only country over there in Europe to not impose these, like, the same draconian lockdown measures as the rest of the world. And they were at the time held up as like the cautionary tale. Right. And yet, as we know, obviously whatever numbers they like to trot out about cases and deaths and so on and so forth, it's all kind of meaningless because it would all be attributed to a virus that has never been proven to exist anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, he seemed a little hesitant to go down the sort of conspiratorial rabbit holes, and I can't blame him. But I do find folks of that generation, I think it's a hard pill to swallow to acknowledge that there might be, the Agenda 2030, that agenda, that there's this roadmap for a biosecurity surveillance state. And that I think you and I have really got that in our sights as just what is at this point, having done enough spelunking. But some people just don't want to go all the way there. And they say, well, it's just greed. And that is part of it. But I really think the power piece is actually the bigger piece.
Yeah. Control. Yeah, control. I do think it's high time that I buy one of these meters. I don't have one.
Same.
I think it's one of these. So I bought I think it was maybe gifted to me, maybe by my mother. Hello, Donna. You're listening, I know. I think she gifted Grayson and I each a step counter. These were like little digital step counters that you put on you, and I was using that pretty religiously to track my steps because I have this aspiration, just like Dr. Johansson, to get 8,000 to 10,000 steps a day. And I found that when I stopped wearing it, I just wasn't walking as much. But if I could look down at this thing that's on my waistband and go, oh, like I'm only taking 3,000, I need to get out for a walk. It was this great reminder to get out and go for a walk.
Mm-hmm.
More often than not, on the days that I would wear it religiously at the start of the day all the way through the end, I would hit that target. And similarly, I think that owning a meter, one of these readers, will allow me to see what's happening when I keep my router on at night, for example, or I turn on the TV, or I decide not to plug in this Bluetooth keyboard. And seeing will be believing, that I will have the number in front of me. What kind of exposures am I getting? And then what happens when I decide to go hardwire or plug this thing in or turn my phone off or turn it on airplane mode? I think that I'm a more visual learner in that way, and having those numbers in front of me will prompt like the better lifestyle changes.
Here. I just had a guitar student here before this interview, and he was saying he's done a much better job remembering to practice when he actually like sort of journals it or just writes it down. Like, I practiced today for 40 minutes. And when he sees that every day he is or isn't practicing, he finds he trends to be practicing more. And I think that's just like a nice, easy thing to do for all of us. We can let the days sort of fly by, and at least I can, and be like maybe a little overconfident that I'm doing all the things I want to do. But when you take a second to document just the basics, it does help compound day to day as you move forward.
Yeah, so we're going to journal our exposures.
It'll also be
EMF exposures.
It'll be interesting to see the background radiation level. If you have ticked off all the things and you've shut off the router and shut off the Bluetooth and unplugged the fridge even, or whatever it is, and to see what you're still up against. Because that's the thing that irks me, is that we can bend over backwards to do our due diligence, but then there's your neighbors and the tower down the street and then Lord knows what else, the nanotechnology in the fucking soil that he referenced, that I sort of wanted to pick his brain a little bit more on. But there's just a lot.
And I think that's why I won't speak for you, but I will speak for myself. That's why I do enjoy these conversations, and I think they're incredibly relevant to the subject of terrain, which is overall health, because while we certainly don't like to come at this from the side of fear or
right,
lens of fear. We really want to empower people and allow people to realize their agency over and control over many of their health outcomes. This is one of those where there are things you can do, as he mentioned, like to mitigate your exposure, but then there are other things like that you can't, that we don't have as much control over. And I think that if we are to be selective, because we know we have a finite amount of attention and energy in a day, if we are to be selective about where we direct that energy, and again, we've talked about this, like the activist spirit that lives within many people, where are we going to do that? And if we're not careful, we have that directed in places that are meaningless, or where the media would tell us we should direct it, or we direct it in places where we might actually have an outcome and where it matters the most. And I think that this is one of those places where it matters the most. I do think that our increased exposure to these non-native electromagnetic fields is having a huge negative impact on swaths of the population, myself included, and I would like to see positive change made.
Yeah, someone we should reach out to. I believe his name is Cal Washington, and he's really taken on the effort through sort of the common law approach of holding men and women accountable via notice writing. And as Dr. Johansson said, it's like the corporation, I guess it's maybe a slightly simplistic way to look at it. He's like, the corporations, they're just making their products and selling them and trying to make as much money as possible. It's the government bodies and the regulatory agencies. Those are who we have to hold to account. Like, on one hand, of course, but not just them we have to hold them accountable as men and women. And that's what the law for mankind is. That's what learning the power of writing a notice is, holding them accountable as a man or a woman, not as a governor, not as president of the board, not as the person who's in charge of some, NGO, but as a man. And I think that's where you're going to start to see the needle move, because that's God's law, honestly, when you really get right down to it. It's something that I'm just learning about, but I think there's a lot of power behind holding men and women accountable via notices.
Yeah, we should get Cal on and dive into that a little bit. There was of course, the light bulb that went off when he mentioned essentially how no one is liable. None of these corporations or entities are liable, and it made me think of course, the pharmaceutical industry, the vaccine manufacturers, and how they're not liable because of the law that was passed in 1986 to basically protect them or indemnify them in the case of adverse events or harm or death.
Yeah.
And this is the playbook, isn't it? How can I put these harmful products out there into the world and indemnify myself and never be held liable?
And brand them as safe and effective. I mean, the contradiction is so rich. The more we talk about it, it sounds obvious, but it's comical to hear him lay it out like he did. The insurance companies don't want to touch it because it's clearly a ticking time bomb, and yet safe and effective, safe and effective, safe and effective.
Yeah. So I had to, of course, another light bulb went off just speaking about, and this went off as I was doing research into his work and the screen dermatitis. So this was the first phrase I think he coined before it became later known as functional impairment electrohypersensitivity, but screen dermatitis. So essentially dermatitis caused by exposure to these technologies and this radiation. And it really made me think, again, going back to like this rash that I had that just sort of exploded.
Yeah.
Like, what was it? Just I'm trying, and now I'm again like the Sherlock Holmesing. What was that final straw? Were there a couple straws that were introduced into my life at that time that my body's just like, sorry, can't do it, can't adapt it? Maybe it was just too much stress at the time on top of all this exposure. And at the very least, I look at non-native EMF exposure in my life as a potential trigger, right? As a potential like stressor, toxic load. And so being aware of that and then trying to minimize it as much as I possibly can in every area that I can is like a strategy for me.
Yeah. And the flip side of that coin is to maximize your native EMF as much as possible by being barefoot in the sun, in nature, with the trees, all that.
Yeah. And I have to say,
in the moving water. Yeah.
I have to say, last week, being away, basically like removing myself from this environment right here. I mean, I got all my work done, right? So I didn't do a ton of work that week, right? I was barely on my computer.
Yeah.
And we spent the rest of the time barefoot, either at PorcFest or barefoot in the river or out in the sun. And I have to say, I felt amazing. Like my body, my mind just felt incredible.
Same.
And I want to remember that feeling so that I get more of it as much as I can in every day and week moving forward. I don't just get sucked into this digital world again.
Yeah, here. I mean, and before I met up with you folks, the week before PorcFest, I was at a music camp on an island in the middle of Lake Winnipesaukee, where there is electricity, but only in sort of the main buildings, like the dining hall and the rec hall. But everyone's living essentially off grid otherwise, with composting toilets and little cabins dotted along the island, looking at the lake. And yes, we're all blissing out because you're on an island with incredible musicians making music for a week. But that is like obvious. I think the hard to quantify part of why everyone feels so goddamn high all week is that you're away from the onslaught of stuff and EMF and checking your phone. They really discourage people from using their phone, like use it to check the time or make a voice memo, but like, and people honored that. And it's a whole other level of like reconnecting to yourself and to nature that is acknowledged at a surface level, but I'd like to acknowledge it at a much deeper level as like at least 50% of what makes that week so special.
And imagine rather than 2 out of 52 weeks that you're
Right.
living that way, that it's like 50 out of 52 weeks. It's just
Correct.
inverted how much better I'd feel and we'd feel. And yeah.
Everything's easier. Yep.
Everything's easier. More of that, please.
Yeah.
Last thing. Well, two last things. We put up the Isaac Lazell video on YouTube. He had warned me because interviews that he has done in the past that have made their way to YouTube have been pulled. So he's like, I'll be really interested to see if it ends up getting pulled. And it's funny because that usually that kind of information that he was sharing isn't the type of stuff that gets flagged as misinformation. It's been up since yesterday. It's been fine. Folks, you can go watch that interview if you want. Pretty interesting because he does hold up a lot of the devices that he's making, so you can see it with your own eyes, which I think is kind of fun. But we did get a comment. I just want to share it because it's kind of funny sometimes. This guy, I'm not going to use any names. Damn, I subscribe to this channel to enjoy discussions on terrain theory, but you invite so many con men and their new age BS stuff. It's not even funny. Would you mind renaming the channel? Because you do a disservice to humanity by polluting serious topic with utter charlatanery. Charlatanery, I guess is how you would. Charlatanery. Charlatanery. That was the comment that we got. First comment we got on that video yesterday. First of all, everyone's a critic behind their keyboard.
Sure.
There's part of me that takes that to heart and goes, okay, this person thinks that we're steering too far from the topic of terrain. But then I think that we're not. I mean, isn't this...
To me, it's meat and potatoes terrain. Yeah.
Meat and potatoes. So to this individual who may or may not ever hear this segment of this after party in this pineal room, to me, it couldn't be more terrain. It couldn't be more terrain oriented. Granted, as Dr. Johansson mentioned, we need scientific studies on orgonomy specifically to determine if this actually does harmonize the non-native electromagnetic fields in any way. Of course, I was thinking that same thing. We should have that. Maybe it exists and I'm not aware of it. However, we can still hypothesize and we can still invite these people on who make the claims and who sell some of these products and get some of their background and their information. And if it does work, I mean, the fact that Isaac is introducing like the biofield tuning technology into his devices, I mean, it's also terrain focused.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah. No, it's maybe fringe.
It's fringe.
But so is the no virus position. I mean, a lot of what we talk about is fringe.
Yeah.
And it's also, well, that's what I appreciated about Dr. Johansson saying, get a meter, see for yourself. I still need to do that with, I invested in some of Mitch's products. I've got a big honkin' orgonite pyramid. It's maybe a foot tall. Just a black pyramid by my router, but I haven't AB'd with a meter to see if it's making a difference. I feel like it is. I've been going around busting some towers with some of his earth pipes, and especially the one closest to my house. I'm always driving by that thing and looking out of the corner of my eye, any birds landing on it yet? And I did see my first bird on it. Put a bird on it, as Portlandia would say. A couple weeks, maybe 3 weeks ago before I left, which made me feel really good. Now, were there birds landing on it beforehand that I just wasn't bothering to look at? I don't know. Maybe birds hang out there all the time.
Yeah.
But for me, we're up against so much that I'm happy to throw the Hail Mary and just try it all and see what sticks, especially because when you talk to Mitch, he doesn't necessarily have the receipts to back it up, but he certainly has the lived experience to back it up, right? With the countering the weather modification in the desert, the regreening of the desert. That was his example of, I'm in an urban environment. All of a sudden there are birds landing in here and this and that. And it doesn't grow on trees, but it makes trees grow. But I look at my own garden. I put like a 4 foot to 5 foot copper wrapped dowel stick in every one of my garden raised beds. And I was gone for 2 weeks. And granted, Ruth was watering a bit and the in-laws were helping a little bit, but everything looks incredible. There's no pests. There's no bugs. Everything's big and happy. It probably wasn't watered as much as it could have been. I attribute that to like the field is balanced, you know? I also took some of those before I left, these little guys, these little black pucks. I put one in each corner of the garden because Mitch is such a boss. He sent me a few extras. So I went hard on the orgone in the garden, and the garden is thriving. So, you know.
And as go ahead.
I don't have a control. I don't have a second garden where I didn't do that too, but you know, whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, I saw a bumblebee. You know, Dr. Johansson was just saying bees are in decline. Bees are fucking not in decline in my yard. Like, I don't want to mow because I've got so much clover in my yard, and there's a bee every 2 or 3 feet. They're everywhere. And I saw a bumblebee hanging out on my basil plant. It seemed to be like having a little issue with a fly. They were both on the same plant. They were like sparring with, but the bumblebee was like 1.5 to 2 inches long. It was massive. I was like, what is this insect even? But when I looked at it, it had all the attributes of a bumblebee. So like, I don't know. Things just seemed big and happy and like balanced in my garden when I got home from being away for 2 weeks.
There it is. Seeing is believing. As Dr. Johansson pointed out, it's hard enough to get funding to do the research on something like, you know, cellular devices, wireless devices, all that radiation. Do we really think that we're going to have the industry funding studies on orgone?
Yeah. So like, what do you have to lose, really? I mean, to that critic, it's like, I don't know. Does it, what harm is it doing to ask questions, to turn over newer stones, to see people in these fringe fields, you know, plying their trade and their craft? And I don't know. I think, it's a net gain. If it doesn't speak to you, move on, but like cancel the podcast or rename it. Like, I don't know, fucking grow up, you know? Yeah.
Yeah. I just told him, I thanked him for his constructive criticism and positivity. And I wished him a happy day.
Good for you. It's always better to take the high road.
Well, I have to be, as Isaac said, I'm going to be the living orgonite device. That's it.
Yeah.
I'm going to transmute the negative energy into positive energy. That's it.
That's beautifully said. But just to put a fine point on it, if these technologies are causing our biology to degrade, to cause the cytopathic effect to happen within us, and there's methods and methodologies and devices to counteract that, like what could be more terrain theory than that?
Yeah, exactly.
Is mitigating degradation of our fucking terrain.
Yeah. So the exploration of said technologies and mitigation is
that is what our podcast is. Right. Every episode is that.
Right.
So
to that individual. That's a lot that we devoted 5 minutes to that individual and his comment, but I think it was worth it.
Yeah, that's good. It's nice to hear the pushback.
Nice to hear the pushback. Yeah. And it tells you a lot about yourself when you get that criticism and you see how you handle it.
I think you positively mitigated that energy more successfully than I did. I just wanted to dunk on that motherfucker, but you need both. That's why we're a good team.
That's right. There you go. I got the white shirt on, you got the black shirt on.
Yeah, right. It's like when I was driving home from blissful, glorious North Country, New Hampshire, and then as soon as I got into Vermont, I was like, fuck Vermont. I was like, I just went so dark. I was like, get me out of this freaking mandate ridden place.
Yeah.
I love you, Vermont. I know there's a lot of good people there, but like coming from New Hampshire, the contrast was stark, especially coming from Porcupine Fest.
Yeah. I love you too, Vermont. I miss a lot of aspects of you, but as I said to you, Mike, less so every day.
Yeah. Or as the great T-shirt says that I saw several people wearing at Porkfest. It's not you. It's not you. It's us. You know, it's a picture of New Hampshire breaking off from the Union. Yeah. It's not you. It's not you. It's me. So yeah, we've changed.
We've changed.
We've evolved.
Well, folks, nothing you heard here should be taken as medical advice. Neither Mike nor I are medical experts. Remember that you are light, you are love. We are neither con men nor charlatans. You are your primary healthcare provider. Thanks for tuning in, and we will catch you on the next one.